with our first speaker. This is Gabrielle Samuel. She is a lecturer in King's College in London. Her background is in neuroscience and also sociology and ethics. And she's going to talk about our moral obligations as scientists in sustainable research.
Hi, I'm Gabby Samuel, and I've been asked to talk to you today about ethical obligation to consider social and environmental harms in data-driven research. It's such a pleasure to be invited to come and speak to you today, and I'm just so sorry I can't be there with you in person, and I really hope that you're enjoying the conference and having an amazing time. So my background is ethics and sociology, and most of my research explores the environmental impacts of data-driven health research. So I'm going to chat to you today about the ethical and social issues that are related to that, mostly talking about the need to consider these from a moral standpoint, but also talk to you about some of the complexities of doing so in practice. So I'm sure most of you use big data all the time. It's interesting to sometimes reflect on how large the data sphere is becoming. So the global data sphere will grow from 33 zettabytes in 2018 to 175 zettabytes by 2025, which is next year. And about half of that data sits roughly on the cloud. And if your knowledge of zettabytes is as poor as mine, then 1 zettabyte is equal to 1 trillion gigabytes. So it's quite a large amount of data. And the amount that we're using data and the amount we're interacting with data is increasing worldwide and at a really fast pace. So if we look at how long it took for 1 million users to use ChatGPT, which was 5 days, and compare that to Spotify, which was 150 days, or Instagram, which was 75 days, we can see how quickly we're increasingly adopting digital technologies into our own daily lives, which come through the use of ever more data-driven technologies and so forth. So we're using more data. And within this global data sphere, healthcare data, or health research and care data, is taking an increased prominence. So while healthcare currently has the smallest share of the global data sphere among key industries, it's primed to not just grow the fastest, but also to surpass the media and entertainment sector and match the financial services sector by 2025. And this growth reflects advancements in health research and care and analytics and imaging technologies, as well as the increasing amount of real-time data created in medical care. Now, the concern is that all of this data that we're collecting, and I'm sure you're very well aware, has a material impact, right? Because digital technologies are not virtual. They don't exist, in the cloud in, some immaterial way, but they have materiality and they have physicality. So data storage and processing happens on computers in server farms, which are just rows and rows of computers. I'm sure you've seen these kind of pictures before. And anything that has physicalness or materiality also has an environmental impact. These are some really nice diagrams just to show you how widespread the physicality of digital technologies and infrastructure goes. So on the top is just a map of the underwater cables that exist around the globe to connect our digital world. On the bottom left, you'll see a hyperscale data center, which is over 1 kilometer long, which is just basically computers and computers and computers, rows and stacks of them. And then on the right-hand side is the number of data centers per country, though bear in mind that this doesn't take into account the size of data centers. So, I mean, it's an interesting figure to look at, but I wouldn't bear any particular rigor onto it. So if we think about the environmental impacts that are associated with the digital sector, we can divide them into about 3 main categories. So the first one relates to the use of mining to collect minerals and metals to be able to develop the digital technologies and the infrastructure. So mining isn't morally problematic on its own, but it's the way in which we mine can become problematic, and our continuous need to excavate and exploit other countries, and also in our own countries, various minerals and bodies, so that we can fuel our data-driven revolution, is something that we need to be very well aware of. Here's just one example. An estimated 35,000 children work in perilous conditions to extract cobalt from the ground in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Digital technologies, and I'm sure you've seen this in the news, have really high energy demands. So the digital sector accounts for between 2 to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This will obviously depend on where data centres are based, because of the emissions that are used in each country and how much that country is drawing on renewable energies. And when you hear of big tech talking about moving towards net zero, we also need to think about aspects like power purchase agreements, so buying renewable energy but using fossil fuels, and that's a bad side, but on the good side, developing new tools to overcome, the energy demands that are associated with the digital sector. In long and short, what I'm trying to say is that it accounts for quite a large portion of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's much more complex than that when we start to break it down and look at it. But unfortunately, I don't have time to do that today. And then finally, the digital technology sector is associated with a lot of electrical waste. So in very, very, very simplistic terms, we often higher income countries dump our waste in lower to middle income countries. Lower to middle income countries have put regulations to lower this, but then they have their internal e-waste that they need to deal with, and it's also going to put pressure on higher income countries. What are we going to do with our e-waste? But there's a lot of illegal movement of e-waste as well. Anyway, this waste gets dumped in these large e-waste areas where communities come into an informal recycling centre where they use hazardous chemicals and materials to extract minerals from this waste so that they can sell it for their livelihoods. And this puts huge problems on the environment and on their own health. And Josh Lepowski has argued that it's not just about the end product that's e-waste, but also during the manufacturing of digital technologies that produces a huge number of toxins. And we don't have to go far to figure out where these toxins are. I mean, we can look at, Silicon Valley, which was a huge chip development place in the 1970s and the 1980s. There's a toxic superfund in the US, which means it's, it's so environmentally damaged and it's basically inhabitable in some places. And so we need to reflect on all these environmental impacts, but we need to do so in a way that doesn't just say, oh, we need to regulate and that's going to be the problem, we're just going to ensure everything's been regulated, as though that's the solution. Because each of these different sectors, whether it be e-waste or whether it be mining or manufacturing, has its own, issues that are related to cultural issues, personal issues, workers' issues. People are working there to earn a living and they have their livelihoods there. So how do we think about that when health might not be the most important thing to them, or the type of health that we want to remove, whether it be environmental health or their own health, might not be their primary issues or concerns in their own livelihoods. So how can we think about all of these issues as kind of health researchers doing our health research? And before I kind of get into how we can think about considering these issues, I want to talk a little bit about the moral imperative to consider these issues. So I've argued in some publications that the adverse environmental and health impacts associated with digital and AI health research are particularly problematic when we use these technologies in the health context, because there appears to be an internal contradiction between the goal of improving health conditions and the environmental and health risks due to their environmental impact. As such, data-driven AI health research has a special interest in addressing its adverse environmental and health impacts, not only as a matter of international priority, but also as a commitment to health. Yet how we do that is open to question. So a lot of people have started to come into the space and argue similarly that we need to consider these environmental impacts in health research and research more generally. And so what you're starting to see is a whole range of ethical justifications for why we need to think about these issues. So some, and I don't think I've got time, I think this talk is 10 to 15 minutes, so I won't run through all of these, but just to say that there's a range of ethical justifications that explore this. So one is utilitarian. So utilitarian, I'm sure you're aware, is an ethical principle that argues that we should do that which produces the most good. So the argument here is that when we normally think about utilitarian arguments in healthcare, if we're not including all these other environmental impacts that come from the manufacturing and waste that are associated with healthcare products, then we're ignoring key links in the consequentialist pathway that are associated with harms. And that's really problematic because Pearce and Jameson argue that when these burdens are added, everyday decisions unquestioned by ethicists and regarded as rational and even praiseworthy may be seen as questionable and possibly maleficent. Another argument is from the justice literature, which is a key underlying principle of modern day societies, and I'm sure you've heard of social justice, environmental justice. In a globalised world, to be just means ensuring fair and equitable distribution of benefits and burdens, not only within national boundaries, but also to anyone subjected by governance structure. And so understandings of justice need to therefore consider individuals and communities affected by a particular process, technology and or product, wherever they are in the world and whatever aspect of that product, process, technology they are affected by. So it's drawing on the fact that as a matter of justice, we need to consider these issues. The planetary health, One Health as well, ethic argues that humans and the environment flourish together. And so we need to think about this when we're thinking about the environmental and human health and how that comes into decision making. And even if you don't kind of agree with any of these ethical arguments, from a solidarity perspective, you can take a pragmatic approach. You can say these environmental impacts are global, especially climate change, right? We're all seeing the impacts of that wherever we live in the world. And therefore, solidarity or being solidaristic to others, even if they're far away, is really important because it's going to affect ourselves, right? So we work together. We're all affected by this risk, so we need to work together. And then finally, there are some various relational approaches that argue we need to think very strongly about these environmental issues, whether it be Ubuntu, African Ubuntu, or feminist care ethics in the Western world. So Jeffrey D'Souza and myself wrote this piece, this commentary in JAMA last year, where we argued that we need to bring these kind of ethical normativities into research ethics and the way we calculate research ethics deliberations. Normally we do a cost-benefit analysis of benefits and harms. And what we've argued is that ordinarily we see harms at just the individual level, but when we think about benefits, we think about benefits to future society as well as potential participants. And so we've argued that this is really problematic when we think about risk-benefit calculations because it's very one-sided and misguided and does not properly respect the rights, safety and welfare of non-participants and future generations and the harms that may be caused by them. And I've developed this research ethics framework with Christina Ritchie, where we talk about taking the Emmanuel et al., you may have come across it, research ethics framework from 2008, and modifying it to incorporate not just the digital aspect, but also the environmental aspect. And then if we move away from ethics to see what's actually happening in the field, we see that, okay, this ethical belief, this ethical imperative is starting to drive a whole range of researchers in communities to start to think about how to address the environmental impacts of their research, which is really great to see. It's like fantastic that it's happening from this bottom-up level, and I know it's also starting to happen from top-down levels in some countries as well. And this is just a paper that I co-authored with a range of researchers, who some of which may be with you today, which is an example of this type of bottom-up research, which is exploring the carbon footprint of research computing in human neuroimaging and how we can kind of decrease this carbon footprint through 10 recommendations. However, at the same time, I've done a range of interviews with 26 UK health researchers in the UK. So yeah, this is just, case study one country. But what we found here was that researchers did want to take responsibility through this kind of collective responsibility. But actually, in practice, it was incredibly difficult. We can have these guidelines about what they need to do in practice, but actually they really struggled to reconcile them with other responsibilities they had, whether they be, a competitive markets that they had to feed into, or competitive publications, or, getting a result out as quickly as they can. They also spoke about the difficulties in terms of being able to respond when much of the digital infrastructure kind of sat above them, where they didn't really have control over it. And so they talked a lot about this call for regulation, right? That we're regulated anyway, we're health researchers, so tell us what to do and we'll do it. But the social scientists have been much more cynical about regulatory approaches. They argue that compliance-based approaches are limited, right? They can be really problematic. So I'm not saying regulation is bad, and I'm definitely not saying that. But what I'm saying is, I'm drawing on many social scientists, particularly Nicholas Rhodes, who've argued about regulations can lead to the responsibilisation of the individual, i.e. that we place too much responsibility on individuals, whether they be researchers or anyone else, for something that is a societal problem and needs to be dealt with at the socio-political level. And are there perhaps other responsibilities, such as advocacy, that might be more relevant to researchers or individuals when we start to think about environmental impact? Others have argued that regulation is good, but we need better rules for regulation so it doesn't become compliance-based or tick box. And others again have argued that rather than regulation, we need alternative approaches to sustainability in research. So, for example, the neuroimaging paper I just showed you with those 10 recommendations came out of a funding opportunity that was driven by the need to produce environmentally sustainable research. And finally, I just wanted to mention rebound effects, because I think this is really, really important when we're thinking about issues related to sustainability. So alongside all of the issues that researchers spoke about in terms of how it was difficult for them to kind of enact this sustainability in practice, even though we're starting to see the development of tools, even if we start to use these tools in our practices, we need to ask more wider questions, more systems questions about, is this going to have an impact more broadly? And I don't mean an impact in terms of we're only making a small difference, but what I mean is if we move towards research becoming more efficient, which is often what most of these recommendations suggest, like how can we make our research more efficient so we reduce our emissions and our environmental impacts. What often happens is that if we don't constrain behaviour, which often we don't, it leads to increased consumption. So here is an example of building more roads to increase the efficiency of traffic, but not constraining people buying cars. And so what we see is people therefore buy more cars because there are more roads and we have a more efficient infrastructure, so we get increased consumption. And you can look, if you start looking for rebound effects, you'll see them everywhere, right? Let's build infrastructure to make it easier for people to get from A to B, and then actually what that leads to is more people coming from B to A and there being an issue there. So we need to think about these unintended consequences of using these tools. So I'm going to stop there, because I've run out of time. And just as a summary, I would like to say that I have argued that there's a moral imperative to consider the environmental impacts associated with data-driven AI health research. But in practice, these can be quite hard to achieve. Regulation is a solution, but can have problematic outcomes. Other solutions are advocacy and reframing research for sustainability. But even when we're doing that, we need to be as attentive as we can to think about the rebound and other revenge effects or unintended and intended side effects that come from these changes in practices as we drive from the ground up our environmentally sustainable research. So we need to start taking a more systems level approach. So thank you so much for having me. If you're interested in the intersection of sustainability, health, AI, digital technologies and the environment, scan this QR code. We have a Shade Research Hub that we're trying to bring people together that are interested in this space, and we have a bi-monthly newsletter that you can sign up for, various projects that you can kind of have a look around. If you want to engage or collaborate, let us know. If you're interested in any of the publications or you want to get in touch, have a look on the Shade website probably, and also just reach out by email. So thanks very much.